So this is a hearing before the Office of the State Engineer. I'm Teresa Wilhelmsen, Assistant State Engineer over our Appropriations section. To my left is Mike Drake, and he is our Regional Engineer in our Weber and West Desert Regional Office. And to my right is Clark Adams. He is our Appropriations Specialist in the Salt Lake office with me. So the application that we are to hear is application to appropriate water 16-901. It's application number A81192. Oh, Mike just corrected me. 16-909 is the water rate number. The application is filed by Lithium Power USA Corporation. It's requesting to appropriate 1.114 cubic feet per second, or 201.625 acre feet of water. The source is to be an underground well, and the area is in Pilot Valley. The point of diversion is north 1,650 feet and west 300 feet from the southwest corner of Section 16, Township 3 North, Range 18 West. The well is proposed as a 6-inch well, 1,000 to 2,000 feet deep. Oops. And the use is for lithium extraction for mining year-round. The place of use will be within Sections 17, 27, 29 of Township 3 North and Range 18 West. There is an explanatory that's attached to that application. I'm not going to read that explanatory, so Mr. Giddens, if you feel any of that needs to be applied to the record, let me know, or go ahead and add that to the record. So with that, let me go ahead and get who's here representing the parties. So the application, Lithium Power USA Corporation. Just go ahead and say your names for the record.
I'm Jeffrey Gittens, representing the applicant.
I'm the CEO of the company, Gary Clayton.
Van King, I'm a hydrogeologist assisting with the project. I work for Laughlin Water Associates.
Okay. Gary, can I just get you to spell your last name to make sure I get it correct?
Sure. C-L-A-Y-T-E-N-S, and it's Gary with one R.
With one R. Okay. Thank you so much. So the application has been protested by the Bureau of Land Management, and let me go ahead and get your names for the record.
My name is Roy Smith. I'm the statewide water rights program lead for BLM Utah.
Good morning. I'm Jim Carcat. I'm legal counsel for BLM here. I'm with the Solicitor's Office, U.S. Department of the Interior. And I'd also like to note that we have 3 other BLM employees here that would be happy to help out and answer questions if we get to that point. Behind me to my left is Ken Bradshaw, who is the state hydrologist, Utah State Office. And directly behind me, I have Melissa Wood, who is the assistant field office manager of the Salt Lake Field Office, and Cassie Mellon, who is an aquatic ecologist.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to the applicant, Mr. Giddens,
Thank you.
to speak in support of your application.
All right. Well, I feel like we could just say second verse, same as the first, and go home. But obviously, our application needs to stand on its own 2 feet. Obviously, there'll be some overlap, probably some repeat here, but bear with us. So I want to start with going over the factors that we'll be considering today from the code, section 7338. As it states, it shall be the duty of the state engineer to approve an application if there is reason to believe that. And just as we all know, the reason to believe standard, I'm going to be referring quite a bit to the Heal case, Heal, Utah case, which is the nuclear power plant case. Very recent opinion about these standards and requirements.
Could I have you move the microphone closer? We're barely picking on the recording.
All right. Is that better?
Yes.
All right. Very recent case gives very good explanations of these requirements, statutory requirements, and the standards associated with them. So, as noted in the Hill case, the reason to believe standard is a fairly low burden and something less than a preponderance of the evidence. The first requirement is that there's unappropriated water in the source. I'll be leaving much of my time to Van to discuss some of these hydrologic issues. I'm not delusional. I know everyone here would rather hear about hydrologic information than the boring legal stuff. So he'll be addressing most of that. But I do want to just read something from the case that I think is important in this regard, which says that the Utah Supreme Court has explained that because the policy of the law is to prevent waste and promote the largest beneficial use of water, new appropriations or changes should be favored and not hindered. Even in a doubtful case, when the conclusion is not clear, it is more consistent with sound policy and with the general scheme of the law to approve the application to appropriate and afford the new claimant the legal status and the opportunity to proceed in due order of law and have the disputed questions definitely and authoritatively determined rather than to shut off the determination by the denial of his application. And I think that's where we should start our viewpoint from. Obviously, there's no one else is using this water. And if you look at the reports that have already been mentioned before, but this is from the 1973 report that mentions that the capture of the water being discharged by evaporation from the soil of the alkali flat would not contribute to the usable water supply because the water is not suitable chemical quality for most present uses. This saline water might be economically usable in the future, however, as a source of minerals or a supply for desalinization. I think that almost proved to be prophetic because here we are 45 years later asking for a water right to use this water that at the time no one found usable. The second factor is that the proposed use will not impair existing rights or interfere with the more beneficial use of the water. Again, Van will be addressing this in his hydrologic presentation. But again, there are no existing rights to use this saline water. There's no other use for the saline water. And the technology is emerging quickly with our insatiable need for mobile devices and electric cars. The need for this resource, lithium, is becoming more and more important. The demand is going up. And the technology, along with that, the technology to extract the lithium is evolving very quickly. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The third thing is that the proposed plan is physically and economically feasible and will not prove detrimental to the public welfare. Again, referring to the Hill case of what that means. To prove feasibility, there's three elements. The first is physically feasible. In other words, is the land suitable for the potential use? Clearly that is the case here. There is no other use for this alkali flat. Obviously it's been there forever. No one's found a use for it until now. So it's definitely physically feasible. Is it legally feasible? In other words, is the land legally available for use? Again, our Lithium Power has mining claims that allow it to mine lithium. Obviously, as mentioned in the prior hearing, there's still a lot of approvals that have to be met, a lot of steps to take still, but obviously they all are contingent on having a right to extract water. And that's why we are here at the very beginning of the process of our project to get a water right. As was mentioned before, it's just not economically feasible to go out and spend the time and money getting all of the permits, all of the approvals, drilling all the test wells, doing all the studies, putting together monitoring plans without having a right to the water. And the last one is economically feasible. Again, the demand for lithium is increasing exponentially. In 2018, estimated worldwide production of 240,000 tons of lithium. By 2025, the expected demand will be over 1 million tons. So it's going to be increasing exponentially over the coming years. And as we all know, when demand goes up, price goes up. Hopefully that holds true in this situation. But even now, we have the ability to, we believe we have the ability to produce lithium in a way that produces a profit. I will note that in our original application, we put in a 25% depletion rate. At the time, we hadn't determined the exact technology we were going to use. Again, as I mentioned, that technology is emerging very quickly. We never anticipated doing evaporation, but we were looking at different technologies. We have now identified the technology we're going to use, which we believe will return essentially all of the water we'll be able to pump it out, extract the lithium, and return virtually all of the water back through the reinjection process, which would make our project almost completely non-consumptive. Again, we built that buffer in because until we actually put it into operation, we don't know, but that's what we're anticipating based on the technology that we have sourced. And that technology is being used in South America right now, and extracting lithium at a price point that makes it economically feasible. And that price point includes a lot of transportation costs that we won't have, so we think we can produce it even cheaper than that. And not detrimental to the welfare. Again, we'll point out we don't believe there's any hydrologic impact on the freshwater supply. And we actually think this is a positive impact on the public interest. It's developed an untapped resource, a needed resource, and will contribute to Utah's economy, creating jobs and money for the state. The fourth item is financial ability to complete the project. No one has really challenged this necessarily, but I will briefly address it. We do have the financial ability to move this project forward. Lithium Power has already invested about $200,000 into this project through private financing, and has the ability to raise additional funds as this project moves forward. Obviously, having a water right to make the project feasible is an important step in that process. And again, pointing to the Hill, Utah case, in that case, at the time, Blue Castle had raised $17.5 million of its anticipated $15 to $20 billion project. Obviously, this is not a $20 billion project we're looking at, but that was less than 0.1% of the total project cost, and that was found to be economically feasible and that they had the financial ability. The fifth thing is the application is filed in good faith and not for speculation or monopoly. Again, known as challenges on this. We do have a valuable business plan, and we've only filed for what we believe was needed for our project. And the last thing is complies with the groundwater management plan. There is not one for this area. The policies for Area 16 specifically state that the area is open to appropriation for both groundwater and surface appropriations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Van to address the hydrologic issues.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I think one of the common themes I heard with the previous discussions and the previous hearing was the vastness of the area. The Pilot Valley. The Pilot Valley
Is it on?
Very large. Can you hear?
It's coming to.
Okay, here we go. The common theme that we heard from the previous, yeah, pretty loud, huh? Okay, testing. The vastness of the area, and the photo that I show here, I think, illustrates that quite well. The distances throughout the valley and from existing points of diversion to our proposed brine extraction well are quite far. And I'll highlight some of that as we get into the discussion here. These are the items I'd like to cover in my presentation. We render a professional opinion, and in order to do that, we have reviewed a number of published and unpublished data. The USGS has historically filled this role, and we have their framework work that dates back to the 60s and 70s. So the framework that they built has now been advanced with professional studies and academic related work. And I'll be able to highlight some of that recent work by BYU and the University of Utah. It's appropriate to review not only the hydrogeology, I think, in a discussion like this, but also the regional water uses, how the water is currently being used, and this is appropriate to assess whether there are any potential impacts in extracting the brine. And of course, what you would expect from a hydrogeologist, we'll cover some geology, hydrogeology, with some focus on the geomorphology. The surface and groundwater occurrence, I'll highlight that in some cross-sections. And groundwater budgets, published budgets, and where this brine extraction fits into those budgets. We have a potentiometric surface. This is a groundwater elevation map, and from that we infer groundwater flow directions. And the recent work by Carling and Mayo, which provide some basis for assessing the location of the water that recharges the Pilot Valley, in particular the playa. And of course, water quality is important here because we have water quality in the playa 200 to 300,000 milligrams per liter TDS, and freshwater sources within relatively close proximity. The Pilot Valley is relatively long, 35 miles in length, and the width through the playa from the toe of the alluvial fan on both mountain ranges is about 6.5 miles. So the closest points of diversion that we'll be looking at in the Pilot Range are over 3 miles away, which is a consideration. And again, this was a theme I heard earlier. So we have a single point of diversion and a point of return. Jeffrey outlined that the return in the application outlining 200 acre-feet of depletion, but it's likely overestimating that consumption. And through this process, the newer technologies, we don't anticipate that we would even consume 200 acre-feet. The Pilot Range is a very high, prominent range in the area, and its elevations extend up to over 10,700 feet. The Silver Island Mountains are also a relatively large range, and those elevations are 7,500 feet and above. So very high relative to the valley floor, which is 4,250 approximately at the well site. So we have some 6,000 feet of relief above. In order to render this opinion, we've been very, very diligent in looking at not only the USGS work that I mentioned, but also more recent work, and in particular, recharge studies by Carling and work by Mayo, which is ongoing. These are multi-year studies. We've heard quite a bit about the Steffens work, and I referred to some of the regional mapping and so forth, geologic mapping in this study. So there is a plethora of data. This is not only data, but interpretive reports. We've relied on both. The USGS has been collecting data, and they have a monitoring well network. Their funding is not what it was previously, but we've relied on much of their data from the 60s and 70s. May be difficult to see here, but there are a number of points of diversion. The red triangles are point-to-point sources along stream channels. There is a discharge of springs. We refer to it as the spring line. I'll get into that in some detail. And also shown on this figure is this blue boundary. Not to be confused with the place of use of the water right. This is the placer claim boundary. There are some 220 claims which combined describe this area. The point of diversion in the application and the point of return. I've also shown the location of the approximate location of a processing facility, which would be in the Silver Island Mountain Range. A closer view of that area. These are ephemeral streams primarily, ephemeral, meaning they only flow during precipitation events, short duration of the year. There may be a single perennial stream, but it would not reach the valley floor. It would terminate at fairly high elevation. So considering the three-dimensional nature of this, the stock watering, S meaning stock watering, we've got other uses, domestic uses, municipal uses, and so forth, and I'll summarize that. But considering the three-dimensional nature of this, many of these sources that we see here, the points of diversion, are sourced by upper elevation water resources. We're 4250 at this location, and many of these, extend up many thousands of feet above the valley floor. So the municipal sources, these are Wendover's water source, which is diverted into an aqueduct, a pipeline. Approximately 400 acre-feet of water is diverted annually and used for municipal purposes. This is just to show the value of water resources in this area, this is a 20-mile pipeline. A 20-mile pipeline that requires water treatment. These sources are under the direct influence of surface water, so to bring them, to polish it to drinking water standards, it's necessary to treat the water. The spring line that I mentioned earlier at about 4260 feet in elevation is shown here. Many of the workers describe this as the location. It's a break and slope, that the spring discharge is a result of a change in the land surface. And that, coupled with the change in lithology, we get an upwelling of water and spring discharge. Water quality at these upper elevation areas is fresh. It's this is drinking water quality water, and to the extent that the ephemeral stream channels flow, the water quality here, the total dissolved solids are approximately or within 100 milligrams per liter TDS, so quite fresh. Along the spring areas here, it's also fresh water resources, definitely under 1,000 milligrams per liter, but generally in the range of 300 to 500 milligrams per liter. And then we have the brine deposits at 200 to 300,000 milligrams per liter. I've shown on this the irrigation, the approximate extent, just a quick delineation that we've done based on air photo review, and that approximates about 900 acres. What I was trying to do was resolve a number that was provided by the BLM here. They, in their protest, identify 1,200 acres of approved irrigation. These are the extent of the actual irrigation as measured today, and it truly is a liberal delineation of that. These are, again, based on air photos, and it's sort of a first pass of what that might be. We have relatively recent mapping of the area, not shown here. Because of the scale of this project, we have 7.5 series maps that we've reviewed. That would be at 1 to 24,000 scale mapping. The map shown here by Stokes and Hinsey is a compilation of quite a bit of work. But also in our review, we've looked very closely at the detailed geologic maps. This is just for illustration purposes. There are bedrock, and this bedrock is an aquifer. The bedrock is Paleozoic limestones and dolomites, as well as some metamorphics and some quartzites and so forth. There's also, you see here, this is a tertiary deposit, which is an intrusion. The bedrock is highly fractured. There are faults and so forth, so it may, in some areas, approximate a porous medium. And then we have the alluvial fans with, at the head of the fan, very thin veneer of colluvial material, and then a larger wedge of material as it extends downslope. The interface between the lacustrine deposits, that's the lake deposits, and the alluvial fan, there are some interbeds. This is a simplified cross-section of the area, and we have, of course, the pilot range at very high elevations, and the Silver Island Mountains also respectable. This particular cross-section has vertical exaggeration associated with it 5 times. But you see the purpose here is to show the relationship between the bedrock and the alluvial fan deposits. The regional structure is a graben. It's a asymmetric graben with, on the east side, the Silver Island Mountain side, there are some imbricate faults. It's sort of a hinge zone. And then on the west side of the valley of the playa, there's a large normal fault, north-south trending, where a significant amount of offset has occurred. The groundwater is present in the bedrock, in the fractured rock, as well as the alluvial fan deposits. Fortunate for us, it's also present in the lacustrine deposits with interbedded clays, silts. It was described earlier as some sandstone. I think for the most part it's unconsolidated, so or semi-consolidated, and then some literature describes conglomeratic units. These would all be targets of the proposed extraction well. This figure identifies the sources of recharge and discharge. I'll put numbers to these here shortly on the next slide, but just understanding the major buckets of water, per se. One of the large ones is subsurface inflow. There is a significant amount of water that flows in the subsurface from adjacent basins and provides a source of recharge to the basin. There are upper elevation perennial streams, perhaps one, which provide through subsurface seepage and infiltration some recharge, and direct infiltration of precipitation, which is also another large component of the recharge system. The recharge in the pilot range is somewhat different than the Silver Island range. Recent work by Carling and others have identified that the primary source of recharge, and this is an important issue, the primary source of recharge to the pilot playa is the system in the Silver Island Mountains and not the Pilot Peak area. And I'll get into that in some detail. But again, on the Silver Island side, direct infiltration of precipitation and subsurface inflow as sources of recharge. Sources of discharge largely dominated by evaporation and evapotranspiration. And there is the freshwater withdrawals, which are delivered to Wendover City, again, in the range of 400 acre-feet, and the spring discharge, which has been described previously. The new stress on the aquifer would be the brine withdrawal, but it's minimal relative to the groundwater budget, which is shown here. It's in a state of approximate equilibrium. Sources of recharge include subsurface inflow, and that's this 4,100 acre-foot number. Sources of infiltration of precipitation, which brings it to approximately 8,000 acre-feet. And then the discharge. You can see the 4,000 and the 3,400 numbers. Those are the evaporation and evapotranspiration numbers. That is the primary target for the brine extraction well. The concept here would be that as you extract brine and groundwater with high concentrations of dissolved solids, we have an expanding cone of influence. As it expands out, you are reducing the evaporation, and to the extent that there's vegetation, the evapotranspiration. So the target is the 4,000 and the 3,400, but that's not to say that a good portion of the water extracted from the brine well will also come from storage. Like any groundwater system, we would also likely rely on water in storage and extract it. The freshwater discharge is shown here, the 400 and the 200. I found this very fascinating that in my research, quite a bit of work has been done on this actually, on how the brine system circulates groundwater. And some of these authors describe a network of vertical joints, and which in my work in the Wasatch Range, it approximates what we see in these fractured rock aquifers. That there's a higher permeability through these fracture sets, and so the point here is that the brine can circulate, and it does through these interconnected joint patterns. I found that very fascinating, and perhaps that might increase the hydraulic conductivity, in particular in a vertical sense, but it makes wells like this viable. Not just, tight lacustrine clays, but ways for the fluid to flow. Nothing beats photos, so let me talk a little bit about some of these landforms and what we see out there, because it's directly tied to the water resources and how these systems are interconnected. The bedrock system at elevation is shown on the upper left. The alluvial fan deposits, starting out as a thin veneer, a thin wedge of material, colluvial deposits that have that are somewhat blocky, larger diameter material, and then towards the toe, it's finer grained. The ephemeral stream channels meander and braid across that deposit, and when they do flow during those periods of higher precipitation, they are losing and significant sources of recharge to that valuable freshwater system. The water then continues in that direction and is discharged in springs. They're easy to locate when you're out in the field. These are these vegetation oasis locations along the spring line at approximately 40 to 60 feet. And then in this case, from this photo location, the proposed brine well is still another 3+ miles off to the east. We're looking north here. The bedrock is highly fractured, blocky, and water would circulate through it. And then you can see the coarse-grained alluvial fan deposits, the ephemeral stream channels, which I have not seen flow in, but do flow on occasion, and then fine-grained material at the toe of the alluvial fan, at which point there's a break in slope. And the prevailing concept with the recent researchers is that the spring discharge occurs at the break in slope. So there's a topographic component to it. And as I'll get into here shortly, there is also an unconformity, and I'll try to describe what that is. That unconformity may also have some control over spring discharge. Fascinating area, and it's you know, from a hydrogeologic standpoint, having the exposures of these materials with little vegetation, I think that helps. As a geologist, I find it very interesting. This is a potentiometric surface map, which these are 1-foot contours across the playa based on USGS water level data. The USGS has a number of monitoring points. These red wells, which are in the shallow groundwater system, they've measured they've measured water level, and they also have water quality data associated with those points available to the public. So there is just a plethora of data, and using these, we have been able to estimate the groundwater flow direction as being normal, being perpendicular to the flow direction. And this is the first indication that the Silver Island Mountains play a significant role in the recharge of the basin. The groundwater flow direction is from the Silver Island Mountains. Carling and others also reviewed that data early, and in their recent work, they've done a recharge study, which we're looking at here. This summarizes some of their work. They've installed well networks at the toe of each of these large catchment areas. The catchments, the north and south catchments, this is the Silver Island Mountains. They're both located, this is on the east side of the valley, and these wells, 59 of them, drilled into the shallow system along that margin. The thin line you see there is the boundary between the playa deposits and the toe of the alluvial fan. The purpose of the wells was to measure the response to precipitation events. They've got some 5 years of data. Between 2005 and 2010, these annual recharge cycles were monitored. The average annual precip was 5.8 inches. And what is rather alarming here is that the rate of recharge, where there was a positive result, a positive response in the wells, is 82%. The previous water balance, the water budget that we looked at, used the Maxi-Ekin model, which assumes a 2 to 3%. It's elevation-based, but on average, it's in that range. So this is exciting stuff. We're seeing new studies demonstrating that some of those assumptions that perhaps we made earlier are incorrect, and there is a direct connection between precipitation and aquifer recharge. The author, Carling, goes on to make some conclusions about the source of recharge for the Pilot Valley Playa, and they make the statement that the Silver Island Mountains are the principal source of recharge to the Pilot Playa. Here are some additional figures from that work. You can see a precipitation event, these dark bars on the bottom, the vertical chart bars, show a immediate response in the aquifer. These are aquifer water levels, and that response is immediate and contributes to the overall groundwater budget. Alan Mayo, who's with BYU University and also has a consulting company, he's done a fair amount of work in the Pilot Peak area, in the Pilot Playa Valley, and he makes some very interesting conclusions from his ongoing work he's published in this area. The first of those is that groundwater along the western edge of the valley evolves within this 2,000-foot area. So that's expected. We would see a zone of mixing where fresh water and the briny, I'll refer to it as poor water quality, evolves within a short distance. Water level and pressure transducer measurements that they've been collecting over a number of years on as many as 200 shallow monitoring wells demonstrate that the Playa groundwater system is largely recharged by underflow from the alluvial fans at the base of the Silver Island Mountains. So we have at least two major studies here that suggest that the principal source of recharge for the valley is the Silver Island Mountains. And then he goes on, the precision surveying of springs at the base of the Pilot Range indicates that the spring discharges are due to a break in slope. So that's, I would think that together with lithologic changes allow the spring water to discharge to the surface. Let's review some of the causes of saltwater intrusion and water quality degradation. I think this is important because then we can apply the lithium extraction well scenario and to see how it applies. The first of these mechanisms, these are typical mechanisms of saltwater intrusion. The one at the top here shows that if there were excessive discharge of fresh water, there would be concern of this zone of mixing, the saltwater wedge, translating to the west and potentially impacting the well. This is a definite concern. If there is excessive freshwater extraction, we would expect the water quality to degrade with time. A similar water quality degradation would occur on the lower scenario if the salt water were to rise. If the sea, in this case, this example, if the playa water system were to rise, there would be saltwater intrusion and a translation of that saltwater wedge inward, potentially impacting the freshwater springs and the well. Both of these scenarios do not apply to the lithium brine extraction well that we'll be talking about. So let's review what is actually occurring out there, apply those scenarios and saltwater intrusion to the Pilot Peak area. This upper diagram is modified from Kingy 2002. We pull it out of South's work. He's got a couple of publications. I think this one came out of the 2008 publication. But it shows an inversion of the water quality. So it adds a little bit of complexity here, but I think let me define what that is, and then we can see how this applies really to our situation. First, let me go back here. The saltwater intrusion is largely driven by density of water. We heard that earlier today, and this is the typical scenario in an isotropic homogeneous environment. You're going to have the lighter freshwater overriding the more dense brackish water. And then you'd have this zone of mixing in the middle. Well, that apparently is not what's going on, at least at one location at the base of or along the spring line. The study shows that this transect, and these are water quality points where at depth they're collecting these samples and defining what the water quality is along that transect. And it shows the lower density water on the bottom and the higher density on top. This inversion has been explained by these authors as a large hydraulic head. Remember, we have some 6,000 feet of elevation, significant hydraulic pressure that can drive this fresh water under the more saline water. This is interesting. It probably doesn't have much bearing on the potential for interference, but we bring it up here because it's our goal here to understand the hydraulic systems, and that allows us then to make assessments on the potential for interference. So we have this inversion. We also have an unconformity, which is defined through this area, and on the next slide I'll be able to describe what that is. In addition to many of the other studies, the recharge studies that are going on, there's also been a fair amount of work with high resolution seismic reflection in the area. South had done this work, and what this technology is, essentially you're thumping the ground. In this case, they drop a weight onto a plate, and they induce a wave in the subsurface, and that wave then is reflected off of different materials. What South has identified is that there's not a continuous layer of material from the alluvial sediments. They've been truncated from this erosional surface. An unconformity occurs when there is erosion, and in this case, it's erosion that occurred from Lake Transgressive, different stands of Lake Bonneville, truncating the formation. So there's no continuous lithologic unit that would allow groundwater to flow across. I'm not suggesting in any way that this is a no-flow boundary, but it would clearly impede and perhaps slow down that movement of water and the circulation of water from the fresh water to the finer grained playa lacustrine sediments. It also, this author uses it to partially describe why there's a groundwater inversion, that you've got this large driving force, the hydraulic head from above, and the unconformity, which would perhaps define the boundary between those subsurface areas. So let's then apply this to the brine extraction of lithium power. And what essentially we're doing, it's a very simple concept. We're extracting brine and water from the other side of the equation. And so there's a potential of actually freshening the sources. We don't see any potential for interference with the spring discharge, with the existing wells, and in particular with the upper elevation point-to-point sources along the ephemeral stream channels. This saltwater wedge will, if the Kona Depression extends outward far enough that it reaches these areas, it would have a tendency to translate that to the east and actually protect the water quality, which is currently measured at the spring and well location. We've drawn this so that it just as a sort of a concept that with lithologic changes, perhaps we can describe the inversion of the water quality with the fresher water quality found below the more saline water. So let me try to summarize some of our review and opinions here. We've benefited greatly from the USGS and their review, their published work. They set the framework for additional studies by universities, research institutions. That has been really a hotbed of research in the area that we benefit from to better understand the hydraulic systems. The extraction proposed at approximately 800 acre-feet will deplete something much less than 25%. We heard Jeffrey describe how this technology will return a majority of that water back. The BLM is claiming interference on point-to-point sources at high elevation and also many miles away. One of the water rights is over 13 miles north. A portion of the brine extraction wells will capture evaporative, and to the extent that Kona Depression extends out where there's vegetation, it would also capture some evapotranspiration losses from the Playa groundwater system. Remember, those are the big buckets in the water balance. But a portion will also come out of storage. That's not uncommon for groundwater. And when we talk about safe yield and so forth, in many cases there are, dewatering of the aquifer. The alluvial fan deposits flanking the Silver Island Mountains are the principal source of groundwater recharge. Not something that I anticipated learning about, but the recent work shows that the Silver Island Mountains, again, are the principal source of recharge for the Pilot Valley Playa. No fresh water will be extracted. If fresh water is extracted, the project is no longer viable. So again, the target is this 200,000 to 300,000 milligram per liter water, TDS water. No fresh water will be extracted, and in fact, the springs may freshen, if not, maintain their water quality because whatever stress that's placed on the aquifer is on the saltwater side. And finally, we agree with Steffens, who found that for any industry in which brine can be used, ample supplies are available. This was the USGS work from the 70s. So with that, I'll ask for questions.
Let me go ahead and turn to our regional engineer, see if he has any questions for the applicant.
Yeah. Speaking to the feasibility, tell me a little bit about this technology that is, how is such low levels of depletion expected to be achieved?
Well, I've sourced the corporation that has developed this technology. They have 2 pilot plants presently running in northern Argentina, where basically the world is rushing to extract lithium from brines. That's where most of the lithium extraction direction has gone. They have 2 pilot plants working up there, and it's using, they wouldn't completely describe the technology because it's proprietary, of course, but it's using a ionic bedding transfer technology. So basically, I'm giving my friends in the back a freebie here, because they'll probably end up using this also. So you owe me some beer, okay? It's going to, the brine will be pumped over a bedding system that's using a proprietary compound that's stripping the lithium off the sodium chloride. The lithium is molecularly attached to the sodium chloride. And this will break that ionic bond. Remember the valences? This will break that valence. And he wouldn't go into details, but it must be using an anode and a cathode. And it's like plating. It'll be like plating chrome. One will have a positive, one will have a negative. I don't know which one will plate the lithium. He wouldn't describe that to me. Then we take the water, the brine, minus the lithium, and we re-inject it back in the disposal well. So that's the technology. It's not a membrane like our previous people were discussing. It's not using reverse osmosis. It's actually using a ionic bond breaking technology.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had is probably for Van. One of the most interesting things you presented about was that a lot of the recharge, at least in this area, comes from the Silver Mountains. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's probably a number of factors that contribute to this. Perhaps the unconformity, which has been defined on the west side of the valley, may not be as well defined on this side of the valley. It's a question that I also had as I looked through this material. It could be that the spring discharge sort of accommodates whatever discharge that occurs on that west side. We don't have that same spring line, so there are a number of factors here that may contribute to that. The structure of the bedrock, the asymmetric nature of the graben with imbricate faults on this on the east side of the valley, and then the large fault system on the west side, perhaps also contribute to that. But it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Okay, I just have 2 quick questions. Just the land ownership, is it all public land?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. And then one question on, there was a slide the summary slide that Van had brought up, and I just want to compare that to the application. So the second bullet there says that you're proposing to extract 806.5 acre feet.
Is there a typo here?
Said that.
I did.
Oh,
Is there a typo?
I was like, where'd that come from? Well, so the application, the face of the application is applying for 201.625. So it looks like you're only applying for the depletive amount.
I think the explanatory goes in, that 806.5 is the flow rate multiplied by 723.97.
Okay, so-
It is in the explanatory that we would be diverting 806, but depleting 201.
Okay, so when I read the application into the record, then I said or, it's an and in the application, it sounds like?
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify, because I did read it as the CFS or the volume into the record, so,
Yeah.
okay.
And if I may interject, like I'm saying, this new technology that I've sourced, just doing rough math on this, 99.96% of the brine will be re-injected. So I'm cautiously optimistic that at the base of this drill hole, when I perf it, it'll be, I'm hoping, 400 parts per million, because that's what they're getting in Argentina, and it's very likely, and Clayton Valley. Clayton Valley is kind of that's the only existing lithium brine mine in America right now, actually in North America at this present time. And their original levels were around 400 parts per million of lithium. So, we're hoping that has something to do with gravity, I don't know, but it appears it's 400 in Clayton Valley, and by coincidence, 400 parts per million in the northern mountains of Argentina. So there's some mathematical reason why, I don't know what it is, but that's what we're hoping for, is 400 parts per million. So essentially, like I said, 99.96% of what we're going to take out of the ground will be re-injected in the injection well.
Is Clayton Valley the mine in Nevada that was?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Everybody's shaking their head.
It's
Thank
just
you.
south of Reno. It's, it's called the Silver Peak Mine, which I've been to, and it's quite interesting. And they just use a 6-inch pumping hole down to, which they won't describe, but I think it's around 2,600 feet. And they've been flowing it into an evaporation pond for 33 years. So that, just to give you an idea how big the aquifer is, and it's a much smaller, considerably smaller valley than Pilot Valley. And I've been to it. It's considerably smaller, and they've been flowing this thing for 34 years, and it's still making them great money, I may add. Their stock trades at about $43 a share, so they're doing something right.
Mike does have a couple more questions.
What level of permitting are you at with BLM? I imagine this, I'm not going to pretend we didn't have a hearing on some of this, but what level of permitting are you at? What's the stage that you're at with BLM?
As far as I understand, we've staked our claims. I mean, again, it's on. I don't think it's working. Again, it's hard to go through the permitting process without a water right, and I can see us showing up to the governmental agencies asking for permits, and they say, why are you here for a permit if you don't have a water right, right? I mean, that's kind of getting the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask the BLM, the protestant, if they have any questions for the applicant at this time.
Okay. Do you want to go first? Okay. Just a couple of questions. So I'm wondering, given the proprietary nature of the technology and given that it's in a pilot study phase, how did you arrive at the amounts that you requested in the application?
As far as the depletion amounts?
The depletion and the overall diversion amounts.
For your eyes only.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the diversion
Right.
limits were based on what we figured we could pump out of the well in terms of gallons per minute.
Uh-huh.
500 gallons per minute, which translates to the 1.11 CFS. Pumping it continuously, that's how we got the diversion amount. And the depletion amount, again, we, without knowing for sure what the depletion would be, we estimated a little high at 25%.
Okay.
And that's how we came up with the depletion.
Okay, so it's based on the physical constraints of the well that you propose?
Yes,
Okay.
based
Okay.
on what we hope to be able to pump out of it.
Okay. And then beyond the work on sourcing the technology that could be used, can you describe what other sorts of feasibility work or what stage you're at for things like, facilities and cost and all the rest of the pieces that go into feasibility?
Let me answer that. Okay, the technology that we're discussing comes on flatbeds. It's going to be a pilot plant. It'll come on about 4 flatbed semis, which we will set up with the BLM's permission, of course. We'll need to apply for a small site permit on the east side. Van had it shown on one of the slides where it would be, the site. We will route the water over to that and do a test flow through that pilot plant. And just so that you know, we'll be using submersible electric pumps downhole. So there's not going to be pump jacks or anything like that. It'll be very quiet. No one will hear it. Yeah, no one's there to hear it anyway. There's absolutely very few people around there, and where this is located is really far away from the shore. But it'll be routed. You can see where the star is on that picture. I've actually gone to that bank. That's where I sited it, and it's a nice flat zone about 10 feet above the level of the salar. So in case there is a really nasty rainfall, it won't sink into that salar, which is extremely soft, as our friend discovered prior to our meeting.
Okay. And then you requested a well 1,000 to 2,000 feet in depth. So how did you arrive at that number, that depth? And are you going to case the whole thing or just part of it, or what's your thought?
Actually, how I came to it, I'm actually an oil person, and I've drilled a lot of oil wells. And it's just been my experience going through sedimentary layers and hitting what I believe there'll be salt layers, volcanic layers in here, because there actually are 2 dormant, long extinct volcanoes at the south end of this valley. I don't know if the rest of the geologists picked up on that, but there's very likely going to be a tuff in here. There should be, very coarse salt layers. In other words, layers that are conducive to brine, holding of the brine. And I'm just literally going into on my knowledge of drilling oil wells. And I felt that 1,200 feet, we most likely are going to hit one or numerous. There'll probably be bedding in this, so we will hit beds of different consistencies of brine.
Okay.
Until a test well is drilled, it's an estimation. It's the best estimation we have.
Okay.
I noticed, I actually did hand dig wells, a pit on this, and about 18 inches under the surface, there's an extremely nice layer of maybe 1/4-inch coarse salt. And I kept on digging through that, and I'm not saying that it'll go to the basement, it probably won't, but that's another layer of the entrapment for the brine. Just like in oil, we would, it would be in sandstone or limestone. It's in the vugs, as I'm sure you know, and that's what's going to carry the brine.
Okay.
I guess the question that I would just have kind of goes back to this topic of feasibility that we were discussing a great deal in the last presentation too. And so am I correct in understanding then what you would like to do is implement a variation of this technology that's being used in pilot projects in Argentina?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And yet some of it's proprietary. So how are you kind of making that transition from what is going on over there that you're learning about to what you would want to design and implement here?
Well, brine is brine. I don't think the Argentinian brine is any different than the Utah brine. As long as it's carrying the lithium, that's all that interests us, is that there's lithium attached to the salt molecules, and this system works. This proprietary system works. It strips it off, and then you're just left with the brine, which you can re-inject. Now, as for feasibility, can I interject? I've already priced the well. I've talked to drillers, and I can put a well down I'm also giving these guys a freebie here. For $35,000, I can have a driller come on there. I need to get the BLM to give me a road permit, but I don't think that should be a problem because lots of people use this playa for entertainment, quadding and all sorts of other things. But we can bring on a drill rig with extremely wide tundra tires, I call it, and he can push one down to 1,500 if I want, 1,500, and he priced it at $35,000 US, cased with 6-inch casing, and he'll perf. I know, that surprised me. I totally agree, because I'm in the oil business, and I went, how is that possible? He's using used casing, used oil casing, which is fine, I don't care. And yeah, this is the quote he gave me.
Okay.
Any other questions at this time? Okay, our regional engineer does
Just-
have one more.
Yeah, one last question. And some of this is, again, you have the curse of going right after another hearing with this, but this application is so much smaller than the ones we just heard. And I don't think that prejudices it in any way, but do you expect expansion of this? I mean, could we see additional applications if this works out? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, frankly, that's probably more to do with what happens here and the BLM. I don't know if our friends that came before us realize how hard it is to pump water up a hole and how much electricity this takes. But 500 gallons a minute, because I know in the oil business it takes a heck of a lot of power on a downhole pump, because I've had a downhole submersible pump at 2,500 feet and our electrical bill was outrageous. So I'm hoping that the brine will come up in the casing and I can pump it from near surface and keep that electrical cost down. But, you know, it all comes to economics, right? I mean, if your electrical bill is going to be $100,000 a month and you're only going to make $120, it's kind of not a smart economic program.
With that, I am going to go ahead and turn to the one protestant we have on this application, the Bureau of Land Management.
Okay, thank you. Before Roy Smith takes over with this presentation, I'd just like to add or make a point of clarification. In the question to you, the question that you posed with respect to permitting, or has Lithium Power done anything yet with respect to the BLM and permitting issues, Mr. Gittens said no, because it's necessary to first have a water right. That's not correct. If the company would like to come to BLM and discuss what right-of-way or other permitting authorization it would like to obtain, it is not necessary for it to be holding a water right to do that.
Okay. I think what I'm going to do for my presentation is, everybody in the room heard my previous presentation, and I don't think I want to burden us all with taking up time with going through that in detail. So what I'm going to do is move through my previous presentation and just highlight the differences on issues that we have between the last one and this one, and then I'll just ask that the entire PowerPoint be entered into the record, if that's okay. And I guess, and I would, before I go into this presentation, I just want to make sure that there's not a misperception on where BLM is coming from on these two presentations. It's not our intent to use the water rights process to derail potential mining projects. Mining is an authorized and legitimate use of public lands, and we're more than willing to process the applications to get that use authorized ultimately. But what we're saying here is that our process and the state water rights process have to be respected, and the state's water right process requires a showing of feasibility, and most of all, the state water rights process requires information in order to make those determinations. And for both of these applications, our sense is that we're not quite at that level of information that is needed for the state to make, a water right decision. It's easy to say, just give us the water and we'll develop whatever we can develop and proof up on that. But in a basin where there's limited supply and there's other parties that could potentially want water, it could be reckless to just go ahead and start approving multiple applications that end up exceeding the yield of the basin. So we just think that we just need to, go through our processes and get the information that we need to make good decisions. But we're not trying to use this to shut down potential mining projects. So with that in mind, I'm just going to, you saw this presentation before, and for this particular application, we think that the statutory criteria in yellow are the same statutory criteria that are at issue with this particular application, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about those as I move down. Yeah.
That's not appearing on.
Oh, it's not appearing on the screen. Am I not hooked in any longer?
No, just sorry to interrupt, but
I'm glad you
the
noticed that.
PowerPoint is not showing up on the screens.
Okay, Paul's
so-
right behind you.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Did I not? Oh, I got to do start. That's right, from begining. There we go. Okay,
okay.
Sorry, I neglected to do that. Thank you for noticing that.
Oh, sure.
That's an important duty of an attorney.
Roy has trained me very well.
So again, these are the statutory criteria that we think are relevant for both of these pending applications. We've had a whole seminar this morning on Pilot Valley hydrogeology, so I'm not going to go through this again. And we all sort of agree on what the general geology looks like, so I don't feel the need to go through that. But I would like to say a little bit more about some of the points that were made by Mr. King earlier, and we don't necessarily think that the emerging information on the fact that some of the recharge or a lot of the recharge for the playa and the salt system may come from the Silver Island Mountains really changes the equation a lot, because regardless of where that water is coming from, when you put a well into it, the well does not care where the water originated from. If you have a homogeneous aquifer, the well's going to reach out in all directions and attempt to capture water to bring up through the well. So even if a lot of the recharge does come from the Silver King Mountains, we still think that there's the potential for that well to reach out and have a cone of depression that extends over to the west edge of the salt flats and potentially cause problems in the confined aquifer that supports surface streams and springs. But with this particular application, we're starting to look at cumulative effects here. If you grant 4,500 acre feet, to our previous applicant, and then you grant another 800 feet to this applicant, we're looking at, more 5,306 acre feet at least to two applications, which we think together could greatly exceed the yield of this particular aquifer system. So we're concerned about the cumulative effects of granting both applications together. And the main difference in these two applications is the slightly different location, and I think we need to talk about this in a little bit more detail. The proposed POD for this application is only about 1/4 of a mile south of the boundary between Area 13 and Area 16. And those two areas have very different appropriation policies. The Area 13 policy is very restrictive and would lead us to conclude that this application should not be granted, whereas Area 16 has a much more open policy. And from what we can see is that boundary had to be set somewhere because it's a vast landscape out there. And right now it's arbitrarily set on the county line between Box Elder County and Tooele County. And for purposes of administering this aquifer system, you look back at the previous studies, and the one that we all go back to and quote, Stevens and Wood, they specify that they think that proposed POD would still be within the Pilot Valley hydrologic system. It's all the same water, even though there's that administrative line. And so we think, given the hydrology of the area, that this application should be evaluated under the Area 13 policy, and that we need to consider that there's already been a lot of water already allocated from Area 13. And I think we've talked about this previously. We've also talked about potential impairments, potential impairment of BLM water rights. So we think that the same set of water rights is potentially at risk here, but the difference I will note is that this application is slightly further to the south, and so we're especially concerned about a cone of depression extending over to the springs in the southern part of this isolated part of the salt flats, and we're particularly concerned about a BLM public water reserve that we have in that neighborhood and with Halls Meadow Spring, just because of the greater proximity of this potential pumping. And I'm going to go through these. So again, these simplified schematics are, very similar to what Mr. King presented, and I think we'd like to make the point again that if you start pumping water, regardless of where it's coming from, you could potentially deplete the alluvium, reduce the pressure in that alluvium, potentially lose that upward pressure that's creating springs, and also potentially lose surface water sources. Now, one reassurance that we're hearing here is that, well, the actual amount depleted could be very small depending upon the technology used, but we have to be careful in assuming that means there's absolutely no impact, because a big thing could be where that water is re-injected after the usage is finished. Depending upon what layer of the saline system that's re-injected into, that may or may not help maintain that wall of saline water that's holding that fresh water in place in that confined aquifer. So, if we have differing levels of extraction and then reinsertion of that water, we could still have hydrologic effects from that are unexpected and could change the pressures in that confined aquifer. So I think I'm encouraged by hearing about a technology that uses very little water consumptively, but I think where it goes back into the aquifer is a huge question, and whether that will do the job of maintaining those aquifer pressures, because as we noted, that potential reinsertion or reinjection location looks to be a couple miles distant from where the water is taken out. Let's see here. So again, we have this with this application, given the amount diverted in combination with the previous application, potentially 5,300 acre-feet coming out of the saline system, we could still have the same effects for surface streams, where the saline water system is depleted, there's a hole in that system, fresh water starts heading to the east, and aquifer pressures are declining, and then that makes the surface streams during the snowmelt season go into the aquifer instead of staying on top of the ground surface. So we overall have the same conclusions as we did with the previous application, just at a higher level if you start considering both of them cumulatively. And we've already talked, now Division of Wildlife is not here in this hearing, but BLM has the exact same concerns as Division of Wildlife. We think that we have to be very careful about potentially impacting these springs that support these sensitive species and species that are subject to conservation agreements. And we've talked again about all this material about public interest, wildlife, riparian habitat, livestock use. And I think, we'd like to make the point is that, BLM holds these livestock water rights in trust, basically, for the grazing permittees that operate on BLM lands. And so when we're expressing our concerns, it's just not from a BLM resource management viewpoint, although less water to distribute cattle around the landscape would create resource concerns for us. We're also expressing that concern on the behalf of our grazing permittees that could have some serious impacts to their operations. So I think overall, we're at the same place with this application that we are with the other application. We're at a pretty preliminary stage of a proposed project. Not that we're trying to shut down, creative resource extraction processes, and we're not trying to shut down economic revenue and economic activity in this part of the world. We're just at a very early stage, of the process. And until we learn more about this proposed technology from Argentina, we don't really know exactly how much water will be consumed, exactly how it will be put back into the aquifer, what exactly the minimum volume of water that would be needed to support an economically viable project. And like we discussed in the last, hearing, a lot of uncertainty could be removed just with a small investment in some, test wells and some exploration out there. Can these systems really produce the volume and quality of water that they're looking for this extraction process? And compared to the amount of economic investment that would be made in the entire project, it seems like doing that small amount of homework and that small amount of investment to see if these kind of wells and that kind of water is available from these wells would be a pretty, prudent investment up front in these projects. So again, we do have mining claims staked on BLM lands, but we have not received any requests for temporary land use authorization for test wells. We haven't received any plans of operation. And again, we think that getting that information into these two processes would really help us make a final decision and help you decide if this is an allocation of water that should be made. And again, these are the kinds of things that we would hopefully get from the BLM permitting process. So again, if, we don't require these companies to have a water right when they come to us and they want to do a test well or they want to file a plan of operations, but it would be helpful for all of us involved if the Division of Water Rights believes that there's just not anywhere close to the amount of water available that's needed for these projects. If you denied them quickly, that would give us that information and, save the companies a lot of time and save BLM a lot of time. If there is a determination that there might be some water available, BLM would be happy to work with the Division of Water Resources to get you information to allow you to make a very informed decision on this application. So we've talked about the need for a monitoring plan, and I think BLM really likes it when we have monitoring in our land use authorizations and when we can, through the water rights process, agree to monitoring with the applicant. We have other mining companies that are operating in the Great Salt Lake area, and we have reached agreements with them through monitoring plans that we think will allow that project to go forward and will allow BLM's resources to be protected. And we're totally willing to do that in our permitting process and in the water rights process with these two applicants if they want to enter into those negotiations. So in conclusion, I think where we're at is I don't think any of us here have a big disagreement on what the hydrology is out there. I think where the focus should be on what's happening at the edge of the salt flats and in that small area from at lake level or playa level, I guess should say, up to a couple hundred feet in elevation above that. where those springs and those surface streams occur. And we need to figure out whether these proposed diversions are going to change aquifer conditions that support those surface streams and those springs. That's where the concern is. I mean, I think BLM has narrowed down its concerns. You know, we're not concerned about the point-to-point water sources that are up high on the mountainside. It's the stuff right along the margin of the lake that we're really concerned about. And I think we can probably all agree that perhaps water quality is not going to be of concern. I mean, the way that they're going to pull water is going to induce more fresh water into these areas instead of inducing salt water into these springs. Now, there could be some implications in the future if the freshwater quality changes a lot. There might be some implications for snail species. I mean, they might have bands of water quality that they are accustomed to, and if you get outside of that band, that may cause problems for those snail species. But I think we all agree that probably saltwater intrusion is not going to be the issue with these wells. It's going to be changes in that confined aquifer that we need to focus on. So with that, that's kind of a summary of BLM's concerns, and the other issue that we'd really like to have you focus on is what policy applies here, because we still think we're in the Pilot Valley aquifer system.
Thank you. We don't have any questions for the protestant at this time. I am going to just look to the audience. There are a few folks here just to see if there's any additional questions from anyone else that is attending from the public. Dan?
Not a question, but a comment.
Okay.
We had a gentleman from the earlier hearing who was here to express some concerns with the prior application. I'm here to express some support for this application and point out simply that we've heard now not from one, but two distinguished experts who have rendered their professional opinions that there is unappropriated groundwater available for use and that it will not have adverse impacts on anyone's existing water rights, whether they be at the edge of the salt flat or elsewhere. So just to reiterate some support, we hope you'll approve this application as well as the earlier applications.
Thank you. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn back to the applicant to conclude.
All right, thank you.
Can I make one point before you do that? I'm just going to make a technical, can I respond to one of your questions there? You were talking about the injection of the brine and how you didn't know how it would go into the area that I took it. Whatever zone, you know what a perforation is. Wherever I perforated on the intake well, you do the equal perforation on your injection well. That's what we do in the oil business, so that you equalize the aquifer or the oil zone when it comes to oil and gas. So that's how it would work. And I did it, I chose the location because we use that spacing in oil and gas, in oil, for our injection difference. And you can actually push a kind of, in the oil business, we push the oil toward the intake well, right, using that injection. And I just thought that it would work, that same format would work with this. I don't know if it would, but it seems to make logical sense. So that was my answer to that.
Thank you.
And if I can add one additional item to that issue, could we turn on the slide set here? You recall this potentiometric surface. The point of return is described up gradient. So to the extent that that groundwater mound would eventually then mitigate some of the concern that you had with drawing the water table down in that area.
I'll use this one. Just to respond to Mr. Carcutt's comment, we understand that we don't need a water right to go to the BLM, but realistically, from a business standpoint, it's just not feasible. Again, trying to get investors and companies to put up money to do all these studies, get all the permits, drill test wells, just not feasible if there's no guarantee that there will be water to be had. And that's the whole basis of the project. Without water, project fails. I disagree that there's a need for test wells at this point. Frankly, I don't think the test wells will give the data that they would want anyway, which is they want to know what the impact would be over time. Without drilling the wells and using them, we still won't know. And I think what we have, again, as we've seen today, there is a lot of data out here. I was frankly a bit surprised. Originally, I thought, well, there's probably no data out there. Probably more data than many places in the state. We have sufficient data. We've had experts look at it. They've made the determination that based on that data, there will not be any impacts. And I think that is sufficient to meet the reason to believe standard that we have. I think we have presented sufficient information to show feasibility as those standards laid out in the Hill case. I think we've met those. I feel like we're, nobody is at a hearing for an irrigation right asking what brand of swather people are going to use to cut their hay. I feel that's the level of detail we're getting into here. Addressing the policy question, again, the policies are what they are. I think as applicants, we get the policies as they are at the time we file. And the policies allow for additional groundwater and surface water appropriations. Even if we use the Area 13 standards, I still think we met them. Again, as has been shown, not only from the 1970 studies, which show that there was thousands of acre feet still available of this brine water that's frankly just being wasted to evaporation and evapotranspiration. And I think the recent data that Van has pointed out shows that perhaps there's even more than was originally anticipated in the 1970 studies. So again, we agree we're at a preliminary stage. We agree there's lots of hoops left to jump through, lots of questions still somewhat unknown. But again, we think we met the standard of what we need to show for feasibility and the other requirements. And we've met those standards as explained, as contained in the statutes and as explained and expanded upon by case law. And we're happy to provide, as these are being reviewed by the division, if there are additional questions or additional need for documentation, we can certainly supplement as requested by the division or answer any questions.
So with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the water right hearing. And thank you to everyone who's been here with us since just after 8 this morning. I appreciate you coming and all the information you've shared. Thank you.